Now, for the additional technical slot, we have, for the chairperson, we have Dr. V.C. Prakash. He is currently working at Indian Academy Degree College, Autonomous, in Bangalore. He did his PhD at Annamalai University in 2016. His specialization in his PhD is American fiction. His areas of interests are fiction, ecology, and ELT. He has published several articles in national and international journals, presented research papers at various conferences. At present, he resides in India. Sir, we welcome you on board. Sir?
Yes, yes. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible, sir. So you will be
Yes.
chairing the technical session for now,
Yes.
sir.
Yes. Um, yes. There are three paper presenters we have Rahul Krishnani, Meena Shankar, and Chitra CA. These three paper presenters are going to present in this session. First, I would like to call Rahul Krishnani, PhD scholar from Nagpur. The title of the research is Judicial Lawmaking in India, Switch from Activism to Overreach. Over to Rahul Krishnani. Go ahead with your paper.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. Am I audible, sir? Sir, am I audible?
Your voice is low, Rahul. Can you
Yes.
raise your voice?
Yes, sir. Am I
Use
audible now?
microphone.
Is it
Can
clear?
you use your microphone?
Yes, I'm close to the microphone.
Okay.
Yes. Shall I
Okay,
start?
go ahead.
Yes.
Yes, Rahul.
Yes. So, good afternoon, everyone. My topic of presentation is judicial lawmaking in India, switch from activism to overreach. A judiciary is an independent body that is even-handed, unbiased, and unprejudiced. It functions within the framework of the Constitution, defined under the concept of separation of powers. It interprets the Constitution, which is supreme, and at times needed supports the rule of law and the standards laid down in the Constitution. The Supreme Court of India is considered the centennial QV and protects the fundamental and constitutional rights of the people. Judicial activism means the rulings of the court based on political and personal, rational and prudence of the judges presiding over the issue. It is a legal term referring to the court's rulings based in a part or in full on the political or personal factors of the judge rather than the current or existing legislation. According to Black's Law's Dictionary, judicial activism is a philosophy of judicial decision making whereby judges allow their personal views about the public policy among the factors to guide their decisions. The judicial activism was evolved through the process of judicial review, which can be pursued from the unwritten constitution of Britain during the period of Stuart, that is from 1603 to 1688. In year 1610, the power of judicial review was acknowledged for the first time in Britain through the activism of Justice Coke. The then Chief Justice Coke stated that if a law made by the Parliament breached the principles of common law and any other reason, then it could be reviewed and adjudicated as void by the judiciary. Judicial activism in India implies that the authority of Supreme Court and the High Courts, but not in the subordinate courts, to declare the regulations unconstitutional and void if they breach or if the legislation is incompatible with one or more of the constitutional clauses. According to
Rahul, sir.
yes,
Rahul, sir.
yes,
Sir, your voice is very low, sir.
uh, I'll try to speak louder. I'll try to be more loud.
Okay, sir.
According to S.P. Sathe, a code giving a new meaning to the provision to suit the changing social or economic conditions or expanding the horizons of the rights of the individual is said to be an activist court. The Supreme Court of India, in its initial years, was more of a technocratic court, but slowly began to become more active through constitutional interpretation. The court became an activist through its involvement and interpretation of law and statutes, but the whole transformation took years and it was a gradual process. The origins of judicial activism can be seen in the court's premature and early assertion regarding the essence and nature of judicial review. Broadly speaking, judicial review in India comprises three aspects, that is, judicial review of legislative action, judicial review of judicial decisions, and judicial review of administrative actions. The Supreme Court of India has observed that the Indian Constitution has not indeed recognized the doctrine of separation of powers in its absolute rigidity, but the functions of the different parts or branches of the government have been sufficiently differentiated, and consequently it can be very well said that the constitution does not contemplate assumption of functions by one organ or part of the state that essentially belong to another. This was held in the case of Ram Kapoor versus State of Punjab by the Honorable Supreme Court. India's judicial activism can be positive as well as negative. A court that engaged in altering the power alterations to make them more equitable is said to be positively activist, and a court using its ingenuity to maintain the status quo in the power relations is said to be negatively activist. Judicial activism reflects suggested patterns in the administrative, namely expansion of hearing privileges over administrative lapses, extension of judicial control over discretionary forces, expansion of judicial review over the administration, and extending the conventional translation guidelines in its quest for financial, cultural, and academic goals. Course of judicial activism includes judicial activism was almost silent for the first decade. The executive and legislative organs of the government actively dominated and intervened in the working of the judiciary. It was in the 70s the apex courts started viewing the judicial and structural view of the constitution. In the landmark case of Keswananda Bharati, just 2 years before the emergency declaration, the apex court of India declared that the executive had no right to intercede and tamper the basic structure of the constitution. Though the exigency imposed by the then Prime Minister Srimati Indira Gandhi could not be prevented by the judiciary, the concept of judicial activism started gaining more and more power. In IC Golaknath versus State of Punjab, the Supreme Court declared that the fundamental rights enshrined in the Part 3 of the Constitution are immune and cannot be amended by the Legislative Assembly. Another important case is Sheila Barse versus State of Maharashtra, where a letter written by the journalist was addressed to the Supreme Court vouching the custodial violence of women prisoners in jail. The court treated that letter as a writ petition and took cognizance of that matter and issued opposite guidelines to the concerned authorities of the state. Some instances when the mechanism of judicial activism turned into judicial overreach, the Parliament of India has held responsible or accused the judiciary for intervening and overreaching its constitutional powers. In the Supreme Court Advocates on Record Association versus Union of India, the National Judicial Appointments Commission, that is the NJAC Act, and the constitutional amendment was declared unconstitutional by the apex court, and the judgment was delivered with majority of 4/1. The act was declared unconstitutional as it was violating the judicial independence and the existing collegiate system pertaining to transfer and appointment of judges again came in operation. Justice Keher said, the absolute independence of judiciary from other organs of governance protects the rights of the people. The Lodha Committee report on the BCCI, that is the Board of Control for Cricket in India, the Supreme Court established the Lodha panel amid accusations of Indian cricket corruption, match fixing, and betting controversies. In an effort to bring law and order back into the
Rahul, sorry for the interruption.
yes, sir.
Some participants are requesting to increase your volume
I
because your voice is very low. They feel it. Can you keep your microphone closer to your mouth?
it's inbuilt in the laptop and it's speaking from there only, sir.
Okay. Okay. If it is possible, you can increase.
Yes, yes,
Uh,
sir.
Otherwise, go ahead.
Okay. The committee recommended some points such as BCCI should come under the RTI, cricket betting should be made legal, and only the bodies that represent states should have the voting rights, while teams such as railways and services should be given the status of associate members without any voting rights. But these recommendations were treated as judicial overreach as BCCI is an independent body not controlled by any state or central government, so the Lodha Committee has no authority to declare such recommendations. The rulings of the Supreme Court on the National Eligibility Cum Entrance Test, that is the single exam for admission to medical colleges, the reform of the Board Cricket Council and BCCI, the filling of the post of judges, etc., were regarded by the government to be the judicial intervention. In another case, the Swaraj Abhiyan versus Union of India, the Supreme Court instructed the Ministry of Agriculture of the Union of India to update and amend the drought management manual. The Apex Court also guided the state to constitute a national disaster mitigation fund within 3 months. On this, the then finance minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, said, we have the National Disaster Response Fund and the State Disaster Response Fund. And now we are being asked to create a third fund. The appropriation bill is being passed. Now, outside this bill, we are being told to create this fund. How will I do that? India's budget making is being subject to judicial review. Step by step, brick by brick, the edifice of India's legislature is being destroyed. This was the response of the legislature on the overreaching the constitutional powers by the judiciary. The judiciary sometimes has tried to regulate itself and put some constraints on its powers whenever it is required. The Supreme Court in Divisional Manager versus Golf Course Chandir Haas has observed that judges must know their limits and must not try to run the government. They must have modesty and humility and not behave like emperors. There is broad separation of powers under the Constitution, and each organ of the state in legislature, the executive and the judiciary must have respect for others and must not encroach into others' domains. In conclusion, therefore, in a nutshell, I would like to say that the concept of judicial activism has both positives and negatives. If the judiciary intervenes too much in the working of the other organs of the government and tries to overreach the constitutional powers, then this concept of judicial activism loses its importance and essence. Sometimes, in the name of activism, the judiciary often rewrites personal views in the name of activism. Power separation theory is being overthrown. The role of judicial activism cannot be negated or overlooked, as it played a significant role in providing justice to the underprivileged sections of the society, indigent individuals, social and educationally backward classes, victims of trafficking, and trial prisoners. Proper implementation of fundamental rights could only become possible due to the advancement of judicial activism. Due to judicial overreach, conflict takes place between the legislative and judiciary, and the legislative seems to be inactive or less competent to the people. Besides this, the separation of powers on which the democracy is killed by the judicial overreach. An activist court is certainly far more efficient than a legal, positive, conservative court to safeguard humanity from legislative and executive tyranny. When the elected representatives fail to create a welfare state, then the role of judiciary becomes indispensable, but the judiciary cannot intervene in the state affairs just to show its supremacy. That's it. Thank you. I'm extremely sorry for the technical glitches or the low volume.
Yes, it's fine. Yes, presented paper on judicial lawmaking in India, switch from activism to overreach. Rahul Krishnani, here in the judicial lawmaking, though legislative bodies have brought the finalization of some laws, then it is reached to the courts. Though all these lawmakers and laws are brought out, still what you have felt in your paper, and you have brought some of the ideas which are not well practiced and which are not practically used by the clients or the people, the petitioners in the courts, because of the word is really wrongly used. I think personally that often we have hearings in first hearing or second hearings. I think the advocates or judges of all levels of courts, they just hear the cases, not listen to the cases. I think so. That is the problematic one. And even they do not read well what is written in the drafts in a well manner. Though the advocates try to bring what they have written in the drafts, it is not read out and it is not listened properly. That is the problematic one in the judicial lawmaking system or in the judicial system. What's your comment on this observation, Rahul?
Sir, absolutely correct. I mean, even since I'm a practicing advocate, I also go through these problems because we feel sometimes the court doesn't listen to the problems of the litigants, the clients, and their case is not heard properly. And these are the practical problems. And I feel this must be an important part of the judges' training program, and to be more sensitive towards the problems of the citizens, because that is the only place where a person who faces problem from the government will go. And if the judiciary won't be able to adjudicate their issues, then where will the common citizen go?
Fine. Thank you, Rahul Krishnani, for the presentation and your understanding of that point. Yes, we will move towards the next paper presenter, Meena Shankar, Assistant Professor in English, Government Polytechnic College from Kerala. The research topic is reconnoitering literary and fictitious domains of feminist jurisprudence, an illusion or reality. So that is the research topic. Yes, ma'am, you can go ahead on your points, ma'am.
Thank you very much, sir. At the very outset, let me thank Cape Comorin Trust, Dr. Regin, who has inspired me, who had taken a long break from paper presentations, and the online mode has been very convenient to me because I was going through some tragedies and could not go from place to place. So I thank sir for his motivation and his continuous support. And I also thank each and every one of you. And with the permission of the respectable chair, Mr. Prakash VC, may I present my paper. which really focuses more on the marginalized being deprived of law. We talk of an age where law and order is much more easily available than it was in the traditional past. But even today, the marginalized or the people who cannot pay any amount to get into the legal battles are victimized. And just as there are a lot of issues for women, we see how this is sometimes an illusion more than a reality. So I just try to look at the landscape of the literary and fictitious domains of feminist jurisprudence. Feminist jurisprudence, as we all know, is an examination of the relationship between the legal system of law and society. From the point of view of women, this attempts to critique the fabricated domains of feminist jurisprudence from the standpoint of gender concerns in the realms of day-to-day life, the arena of legal justice for all the poor, the marginalized, the weak, as also the elite who have sometimes been financially or economically in trouble. We see that in literature and in real life all over the globes, the issues germane to women, particularly sexual offense, carnal abuse, female feticide, infanticide, child abuse, raping, wife beating, bride burning, wife murder, dowry deaths, the psychological trauma of living with drunken husbands, the domestic violence meted out to women, the mental torture faced by outlaws and in-laws, the physical burden of household chores, unshared responsibilities in child rearing, the psychological pressures of the working women, the perennial women's issues, which are so diverse in form and proportion. And all this is added by the silence with which women or the family take over these social prejudices without taking into consideration the issues of their daughters or their sisters or their family out of fear or inability to enter into courts and be out of it. The lackadaisical manner in which suppression has resulted in the lack of response from the society has often thwarted a woman's life, and the pressures that she has had to undergo in her life has sometimes been manifold. This underlines the fact that gender justice and female legal rights ought to be redefined. Feminist jurisprudence cannot be imposed upon the edifice which is designed on gender bias. Life and literature, the people and the society, we academicians, researchers, intellectuals, thinkers, policymakers, and activists, we ought to comprehend the feminist legal combats from the socio-economic, political, pecuniary, domestic, legal, literary, cultural, aesthetic, and human point of view. It echoes that the discourse of the reality of women's experience and the theorization of all legal institutions and law is in relation to the myriad issues of women's life and the experience challenged by these presumptions that law is gender neutral is very sad and scary for the woman folk. This is a very crucial component of feminist theory because it mirrors the precepts, the methods, the concerns of women. It raises apprehension about the validity of female ethics. It challenges the fact that woman is not just a wife or mother, but she has numerous abilities beyond child rearing, beyond nourishing or educating her children or rendering her household chores with dedication and talent. She's also adept at manifold tasks like managing, multitasking, intelligently balancing imbalances, resolving conflicts, discharging duties effectively, and also able to voice for equal rights and privileges, equality of sex, reproductive rights, equal wages, and can address violence, parity of favoritism to the other sex with courage and independence. Now, one important case that has been found, especially with the marginalized, is their vulnerability. The vulnerability to be pressurized to yield to marriage. As also in the other elite families, marriage has often set an iron curtain on the life of many a woman, because once a girl is married in her early 20s by the family, the submissive powerlessness she sometimes faces in a forced marriage, though not in all marriages, whether it is in a nuclear or joint family, her adapting to a totally unfavorable or indifferent ambience sometimes her lack of achievement in career goals, sometimes her lack for socio-economic freedom, sometimes her responsibilities in childcare or geriatric care must be addressed. She must be aware that the reproductive rights, childbirth rights, and birthing rights are not denied to her. Very often, the woman is unaware of these rights, and this is where feminist jurisprudence comes into play. A woman must be aware of all her rights, especially the birthing right. The first important human right of a woman when she enters the threshold of her family life is definitely the birthing right, the right for survival of herself and her baby. And this right to a pleasant, pleasurable delivery in a place of her choice is important for her physical and mental well-being, as well as the growth of the family. She has the right to demand her choices in this regard, and she is not to be coerced into medical procedures that she does not favor, including abortion, treatments and surgeries she feels ill at ease with, and more. The labor pain of women and examination of the birthrights from the angle of feminist jurisprudence must echo women's concern and take into account women's health. Birthing women are not objects to be processed, but they are human beings with full claim on health care and human rights, and have the rights to enjoy a stress-free childbirth and care. Very often in tribal societies, we see so much of depression because the woman is treated more as a burden in the family due to financial responsibilities, and very often she feels she is the victim. The right to equal treatment in maternity care is also due to morality discrepancies. A woman needs to be able to talk to her care providers. She needs to be heard. She needs to have the right to autonomy to make self-sufficient decisions about her own body as enshrined in legal protections like the right of informed consent and renewal. The human right to refuse any major surgery has never been under more critical study in the tribal hamlets and indigenous population as today, as in the age of increasing cesarean operations in the medical field. She has a right to give birth in the hospital or home with a doctor or midwife, and she can request the presence of a partner or any friend for her moral support during labor. Child right births must be made more aware of to the women, especially the underprivileged. They must be taken up, and women's legal rights during childbirth must be prioritized by giving proper health care. This must be popularized and awareness created so that even the marginalized women have envisioned an equality to the girl child in reclaiming these rights. A legal childhood is often the distant dream of the poor. Legal childhood rights must be envisioned for all children and with equality to all children. Rebecca A. Spence, in one of her books, Abandoning Women to Their Rights, What Happens When Feminist Jurisprudence Ignores Bathing Rights, talks about the importance of maternity care, independent midwifery, and the need to support women to give birth with courage and dignity. Despite newer reproductive technologies, feminist jurisprudence and theories of infertility is an unrealistic account of women who are unable to conceive babies. Very often, it is the woman who is under traumatized or stifled by society, peers, or the people at large in her neighborhood. Hence, it is very essential that as objects of criticism, these women are empowered. Their voices must be heard, and they should no longer be invisible. Linda J. Lacy, in her book, A Reading, O Wind, Remind Him That I Have No Child, Infertility and Feminist Juries, tells us about the story of patriarchy and reproductive technologies that have thwarted the woman. The brainwashed mother therapy, or the remedies of infertility, or even the woman not able to grapple with the sensation of being a childless mother, about commodification of children or surrogacy, have all really taken away the rights of women to live a happy life and have been and to be blamed all along. Feminist jurisprudence is seen in sexual harassment of working women, sometimes in child-centered jurisprudence, the rejection of patriarchy, and the speak for yourself, speak for your minorities, which is missing today. These address women's perspectives because only on rethinking law as inclusive can women assert their power in the family, in the neighborhood and workplace. With all due respects to all other genders, it is seen that feminist jurisprudence alone can elevate the struggles of women and accept the fact that unpaid labor at home or those engaging in domestic chores or in the family is empowering and redeeming for some mothers or women, but not for all. It is therefore essential that domestic jobs and menial jobs are respected, as also jobs where women focus their efforts on intellectual advancement, also social welfare, and the sharing of responsibility that needs to be understood that any labor, whether paid or unpaid, whether for passion or for a living, are all industrious and includes a lot of time and investment and energy. The law must definitely sabotage any form of domination and address the grievances of women to recognize the strength and sacrifice of women before law. Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dawkins were fiery in echoing that the women were losing their power of self-definition and being prey to male requirements, and the legal system had promulgated this cultural homogeneity. Yet, activists have acknowledged gendered workings and gendered implications by saying that laws affecting employment, divorce, reproductive rights, rape, domestic violence, and sexual harassment have often led women of the lower margins in deeper trouble. Hence, feminist jurisprudence must be made compulsory in the legal school curriculum because it is a philosophy of law which is based on the social, political, and economic reality of the sexes. It tells us that it is a methodology of law where we have to argue that gender potential schemes must be redefined for the poor. Feminist jurisprudence pleads that legal framework must erase gender-based distinctions because women are as gifted as others and on par with the others to nourish their talents, savor their lives, and improve the quality of their lives. The law must challenge the domination of other genders by challenging the difference debate and saying that men are men, women are women, and every gender, including the third gender, has an identity and independence of their own. So the right to dignity, the right to virginity, the right to motherhood, and all attempts of sex rights must be regarded as women's special rights. The law must recognize these rights. The law has to support women to look at the women's point of view, and there needs to be an intersection of women, law, and gender to wipe off any form of gender discrepancies and make sure that this is not an illusion, but a reality where a woman can always assert her rights from her point of view. Thus, this feminist jurisprudence has to be more inclusive. It is said that there are no free men without free women, and a man of equality is not threatened by a woman of quality, because feminism is the radical notion that people are also humane, women are also people, and people who are humane and human. That feminist legal theory is based on the belief that law has voiced the historical subordination of women over a period of time, and that we have fought a number of feminist battles by being very empowered, and today we have reached a stage where we are no longer suppressed or oppressed like our traditional great-grandmothers were, is a truth. But yet, this discrimination can yet be challenged to see that sexual harassment, domestic violence, and other forms of injury are wiped off, and that this law, based on political, social, economic equality of the sexes, will be pluralistic, and that all domains of life are encroached by both or all genders in order to have a gender-free society and a gender and to see that there is gender justice all over. As Nicholas Lushman says, all human collective life, or all collective human life, is directly or indirectly shaped by law. Like knowledge, it is an essential and all-pervasive fact of the social condition. Definitely, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. But do we say this is an illusion or a reality as far as the lower people from the lower strata of society or the less privileged are, is a question to debate and to think about. And hence, it is very essential that all women whether they are from the richer or the poorer society, from the educated or uneducated, from the center or the margins. They realize that feminist jurisprudence means thinking over how they could use the importance of law in their lives when it comes to great calamities. All said and done, there has always been a lot of issues regarding women, always putting the counterparts in trouble for issues which are baseless. But when it comes to the reality and grave situations of suffering, where we see suicide and deaths, then the question is feminist jurisprudence a reality or is it an illusion? And how do we reflect on this concept? Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. The paper is well observed. The issues are brought out from the perspective of Indian societies. So here we have comprehended that issues of women are a reality, not illusion. So here in this session, some of the law professionals are there. Definitely, we would feel that they would take these issues to the laws, and they definitely will be implemented. Already we have, but still yet to implemented some of the issues of women. Once again, I thank for your well presented paper, ma'am.
Thank you,
Now
sir.
we will move. Yes. Now we will move towards the last paper presenter, Chitra CA, PhD research scholar, and Dr. L. Lakshmi Devi, Assistant Professor, Annai Velankani College, Tirunelveli. The topic of the research is cultural dismemberment and identity catastrophe in Toni Morrison's Sula. So I think one of your research paper could present either Chitra CA or Dr. L. Lakshmi Devi. Yes, over to the research paper presenter.
Good afternoon. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead, ma'am.
Myself, Chitra CA. I'm a research scholar at Annai Belangani College, Tholeyavatam. Let me present my paper. Toni Morrison is of the view that culture and identity are interrelated aspects. Issues of racism, slavery, physical and psychological traumas lead one to face issues related to one's own identity. This disintegration in identity and individuality results in dismemberment of a great culture, and this fragmentation totally distracts the life and living of the African Americans, especially the women. Toni Morrison's works and characters are identified by visionary force and poetic import through which she gives life to an essential aspect of American reality. Her narratives mingle the voices of men, women, children, and even ghosts in layered polyphony. In Sula, the voices of women are portrayed through Eva Peace, Sula, Hannah, Pearl, and Nell Wright, and that of the children through the Deweys and Plum. Shadrach and Plum are the major male voices through which the social and cultural life of the African Americans in the bottom is exposed. The nature of physical and psychological traumas results in radical fragmentation of the self. The effects of racism on the psyche of the characters in Sula leads them to concomitant experience of dismemberment. Toni Morrison herself expressed her views on racism in her non-fictional work Unspeakable, that trauma of racism is, for the result and the victim, the severe fragmentation of the self, and has always seemed to me a cause of psychosis, strangely of no interest to psychiatry. Toni Morrison's Sula, published in 1973, exposes the matriarchal line of three generations of women. It presents the racial gaze of various characters. It presents Eva Peace, the grandmother, her daughters, and the granddaughter Sula. The white society considers the blacks as subhuman. They are denied of their rights to live a peaceful life. Thus, it sums up a detailed history of African Americans who follows the legacy of slavery against their wish. Sula exposes the life of many female characters, but the whole story moves around Sula Peace and Nell Wright and present themes of gender and identity issues, relationship between sisters, between mother and daughter, and between friends. That is Eva's relationship with her daughter Hannah and Pearl, Hannah's relationship with her daughter Sula, and Nell Wright's relationship with her mother, and mainly between the friends Sula Peace and Nell Wright. The customs and traditions of the so-called blacks in America is described as they deal with pain, fear, love, sex, and death. These fears and sufferings lead the culture to disintegrate, and each and every characters are victims of this distorted culture that keeps them under suppression. They are not given the right to live peacefully and according to their wish and dreams. There is a mention of the suckle pear tree, which is grown in the backyard of Eva's house. Eva is the main character, and she is the grandmother. And it is considered a part of many culture. The suckle pear tree is considered a part of many culture. It is symbolic of Eva Peace, who is strong in her attitude. Her femininity and undefeatable identity is also projected. This tree is fire resistant. This tree is considered fire resistant, and it is in Chinese culture, this tree has great importance. And Eva is also like this tree. This tree is very much symbolic. This grows in the backyard of Eva's house. And Eva is so strong, and she is resistant to all sufferings and hardships that she faced in her whole life. Eva Peace was abandoned by her husband Boy Boy, who abused her very badly. With her husband, she lost her identity, her individuality is questioned, but in order to safeguard her children, when Boy Boy left the family, in order to safeguard her children, she accepted the help from others first. But later, she could no longer compromise with her individuality because she wanted to attain her identity, and she wanted to strive hard to regain her lost individuality because of her husband. So she left the family, that is her children. She's not like her husband who abandoned the family, but she left her children for the sake of their well-being. Eva is similar to Rose Deer, who is also abandoned by her husband. So Rose Deer is another character who is in Toni Morrison's another work, that is in Jazz. Eva Peace is also abandoned by her husband. Similarly, Rose Deer is also abandoned by her husband, who had three children at that time. Three children at that time. But Rose Deer, but she is unlike Eva Peace. She left the children and drowned herself in a well. She compromised, that is Rose Deer, compromised with her identity, and her individuality is lost when she left her children and chose death. But Eva Peace, though abandoned her children, came back and supported them, highlighting and striving hard to attain her identity. After abandoning the family for their goodness, she came back home with a single leg. but she had a huge sum of money when she came back to Medellin. Eva's hatred for her husband, Boy, is a spirit to attain her individuality. The same hatred that she had for her husband is also shown towards Sula, her granddaughter. But she inherited the whole spirit she had against the white. We can consider Sula, the granddaughter, as a mirror to a parallel image to her grandmother, Eva Peace. Because all the spirit that Eva had in her is inherited to her in all ways. She is mentally strong, will-powered, and her quest to attain her identity and individuality is posed throughout the novel. The next characters, the twin boys, that is the grandchildren of Eva Peace, twin boys of Pearl. They are kept nameless in this work, in Sula. Because the blacks are always kept nameless. They are not named, they are not called by their names. They are identified by numbers or, for example, pigmeat. They are even identified pigmeat. But they are symbolic of the fragmented culture of the blacks. The twin boys are distorted in their external figures. So their external features are symbolic of the fragmented culture of the blacks in America. They are symptomatic of the cultural disintegration of African American in a white society. Then the next major characters, Nell Wright and Sula Peace, are the two sides of a same coin. They together form a complete picture. And Sula without Nell is incomplete. While one is stronger than the other one, the other side is a bit feeble, and one cannot live alone without the support of others. The whole represent the white society, the black society, especially the women who actually wanted to strive hard against the atrocities, against the suppression, against the slavery of the whites. But because of the cultural issues, they have to face these suppressions, and they cannot come up. Sula is strong like her grandmother Eva Peace. She is symptomatic to express her individuality and strive hard to attain her identity. During one situation, Sula and her friend Nell was tortured by some white Irish boys. At that time, she took a parking knife. This parking knife is the one inherited by her grandmother. She inherited the whole spirit through that knife to her granddaughter, and she took that knife and cut the tip of her finger in front of the boys to show, if I could do this to me. And she proclaims very bravely to the Irish boys that if I could do this to me, then just imagine what can I do against you? What can I do with you all people? So much power and so much brave the girl was. Toni Morrison's struggle to create a black aesthetic through survival and identity quest of characters in Sula is seen throughout the work. To attain a perfect black aesthetic, the old aesthetic must be dismantled. This means that the old culture that the white has created, the culture that didn't allow the blacks to grow up, the culture that the blacks are suppressed, they are kept suppressed, they are considered legacy of slavery. All this has to be dismantled. It's the view of Toni Morrison that all these fragmented pictures has to be recreated in order to attain the real identity, in order to attain the real individuality, in order to give names to the blacks in America. Laurie Laurinel's words, the Western aesthetic has run its course. It is impossible to construct anything meaningful within its decaying structure. We advocate a cultural revolution in art and ideas. The cultural values inherent in Western history must either be radicalized or destroyed. Let me conclude with Toni Morrison's own words. If you take racism away from certain people, I mean vitriolic racism as well as a sort of social racist, if you take that away, that they may have to face something really terrible, misery, self-misery and deep pain about who they are. To conclude, Toni Morrison clearly presents various causes for cultural dismemberment and the trial of various characters to regain their lost identity, thereby constructing a culture familiar to them. Such a culture leads them to lead a peaceful social life with all rights and dignity. Thus, the legacy of slavery can be put to an end. Borrowing the words of Laurie Nell, it is impossible to construct anything meaningful within its decaying structure. So, it's through the works of writers like Toni Morrison we can advocate cultural revolution. This revolution in culture will upgrade the life of people white dominant society. Bottom is a mention in Toni Morrison's Sula where the so-called blacks are assigned to live. Once the culture is rebuilt, the catastrophic identity issues will also be vanished. Thank you.
Yes, good presentation on this topic, Chitra Madam has presented. As for my observation on this topic on the African American writers' writings, this cultural dismemberment, the culture of African American people is divided into many ways, and they try to identify their culture and they try to find out their real life, how they led their life before these white people started. And now at the present time, even the black community people started adapting the culture of the white people. In the future, they never find out the real culture or the real identity of the black community people. So what's your opinion on this in the future perspective of black American people or African American people, Chitra Madam?
Sir, whatever the situation is, whether it is in the past, present, or future, uh, some changes will gradually occur according to the time. But some perspectives and some common views regarding certain aspects will go on. It will never change. So, as people um, as the attitude of the people changes, a little bit changes can be observed through especially through the works of writers, some major works of writers. They will get an awareness so that they can improve a bit, but the situation will persist whether it is in the past, present, or in the future, but changes can be observed. We cannot completely vanish all the cultural fragmentation and all the cultural distortion, but of course, changes will come.
Okay, fine, Chitra Madam. So we are at the end of this session. I thank the organizers who have given me this opportunity to chair this session for three research papers, Rahul Krishnani, Meena Shankar ma'am, and Chitra CA, and Lakshmi Devi ma'am. And the participants who have participated and listened to the research paper presenters patiently. I thank everyone.